The Fab Four from Liverpool by Helen Byers. Page 3. Yesterday, at the peak of their success, the Beatles rode a wave of amazing popularity. Huge crowds of their teenage fans expressed a type of hysteria that came to be called Beatlemania. In 1963 alone, only a year after taking their final form, the band's recordings sold millions of copies. In 1965, Queen Elizabeth II of England awarded a Medal of Honor to each Beatle: John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr. Years later, in 1997, Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth even dubbed Paul McCartney a knight, in recognition of his songwriting. Yet these extraordinary musicians came from the most ordinary circumstances. How did four boys from Liverpool, an industrial city in the Midlands of northern England, achieve such fame? In the late 1950s, they were just working-class kids who loved music. Page 4. To be working class in the 1950s meant there was very little money to spare for music. None of the families the Beatles came from could afford expensive instruments, and music lessons were hardly considered. At 14, Paul traded an old trumpet his father had given him for his first guitar. The guitar was worth about £14 or $20. John found himself a guitar for £10 and a harmonica. Even George, who would be their star guitar player, learned to play on a guitar that cost £3.10, or about $7. He recalled later that for his family, £3.10 was a lot of money then. Ringo longed for a real drum set, but settled for drumming with instruments he made from biscuit tins and pieces of firewood. Still, even these instruments were enough to get started on, and for these eager young musicians, that was all they needed. Page 5. The musical education the young Beatles received was no more polished than their instruments. Many years later, Paul admitted, "To this day, I have never learned to write or read music." Much of what he did learn about music came from his father, who played the piano, the trumpet, and the clarinet at home. He taught Paul to listen for chords. This was important because it allowed Paul to imitate what he heard on the radio or on records. And the radio and records played a huge role in the musical education of all the Beatles. By the mid-1950s, a new kind of music, rock and roll, was sweeping Great Britain. Young people there were falling for American music in a big way. British band members soaked up the sounds of Elvis Presley, Chuck Berry, Buddy Holly, and others. They listened to the rock and roll all they could, then called for more. Page 6. All together. When they were young, John, Paul, George, and Ringo hardly knew each other. But music began to bring them together in 1957. The day they met, July 7, 1957, John was performing at a church garden party with a skiffle band he had formed with 6 school friends. They called themselves the Quarrymen. Skiffle bands like the Quarrymen played the new American music that was so popular with young people. The Quarrymen played guitar, banjo, washboard, and drums. One of the Quarrymen knew Paul from school and thought he might make a good guitar player for the band. Page 7. After Paul watched the Quarrymen play at the church that day, he showed them what he could do. He played a whole lot of shaking going on. He played Tutti Frutti. The Quarrymen were impressed to hear how well Paul could play some of the most popular songs of the day. John also thought Paul looked a little like Elvis Presley, which was a plus as Elvis was the biggest rock and roll star in the world then. John debated whether it would be good or bad to have someone in the band who knew more than he and the others did. But he invited Paul to join the Quarrymen anyway, excited about what Paul could contribute to the band. The next day, Paul said yes. Page 8. Paul began teaching John everything he knew. He told John that the chords he'd been playing weren't real ones, and showed John the right way to play them. But there was a hitch. Paul taught me how to play properly, but I had to learn the chords left-handed, because Paul is left-handed, John said. So I learned them upside down, and I'd go home and reverse them. Of course, Paul was hardly an expert. He still had a lot to learn himself, and he was also too shy to play guitar solos on stage. So the band kept an eye out for another guitar player. Paul said he knew one named George Harrison, whom he had met on the school bus. Paul told the others that George might be another good addition to the group. George could play the song Raunchy, just like the recording. When the Quarrymen saw him do that, they asked him to join the band too. In the weeks and months that followed, John, Paul, and George constantly shared what they knew and learned about music. Paul remembered, we would listen to guys on guitar, and it became a quest to find chords in records. They toured around Liverpool seeking out any player who could teach them something. It was like a quest for new chords, and they were always putting their newfound knowledge to work. Page 9. John described what would happen when they heard about someone they could learn from. We would hear of some guy in Fazakirley. Was that a long way away? It was, of course, in Liverpool, but it was like going across the world for us. This guy knows B7. We must all go on a journey, John recalls thinking. Every time we learned a new chord, we'd write a song about it. Page 10. By 1962, the future was quickly taking shape for John, Paul, and George. The Quarrymen had signed a record contract and changed their name to Beatles. When they hired a new drummer, who called himself Ringo Starr, by now the former Quarrymen had left the group. So the Beatles consisted of John, Paul, George, and Ringo alone. Then, almost overnight, the Beatles took the world by storm. Young people in countries around the globe raced to buy their records and turned the radio up loud when Beatles songs came on. They looked different from the other bands playing, but it was not their haircuts that made them famous. It was their music. Page 11. Two of Us. One of the things that made the Beatles' music so special was their terrific songwriting. Each of the Beatles pitched in, but for more than 200 songs, Paul and John teamed up. Together, Lennon and McCartney became one of the great songwriting teams in history. We wrote together because we enjoyed it a lot sometimes, John said. They also had guessed, cleverly, that the band wouldn't stand out unless it was different. Original songs would help them do that. Page 12. But deciding how to credit their songs was tricky. John and Paul agreed that they should use both of their last names for every song they wrote. Paul said, "We aspire to be Rodgers and Hammerstein, the great popular songwriting team." Rodgers and Hammerstein wrote their songs for Oklahoma, South Pacific, and The Sound of Music. In teaming up, Richard Rodgers wrote the music and Oscar Hammerstein wrote the words to their songs. The Beatles wouldn't work in quite that way, but they liked the Rodgers and Hammerstein model anyway. The only thing we knew about songwriting was that it was done by people like them, so the two name combinations sounded interesting. The trouble was, Paul wanted their songwriting team to be called McCartney-Lennon. John thought Lennon-McCartney had a better ring. Others agreed, so Paul had to give in. But he knew they had achieved their main goal. We were now a songwriting duo, he said. Page 13. There was no one way that John and Paul composed together. Every time it was different. Sometimes one would compose part of a tune. Sometimes the other would write some lyrics. Then they would share their partial tune or lyrics and together try out different ways to finish the song. In the early days, Paul said, he and John would sit down with our two guitars and plunk away. We'd both have acoustic guitars and we'd sit opposite each other and play. It was great because instead of looking into my own mind for a song, I could see John playing, as if he was holding a mirror to what I was doing. It was a good way to write. Page 14. Once, when they were first writing songs together, the Beatles were traveling in a van. Paul told John he had idea for an answering song in which one voice would sing, "She loves you," and the other voice would answer, "Yeah, yeah, yeah." Later, they sat in the hotel bedroom for a few hours and wrote it, Paul said. It became the hugely popular song, "She Loves You." It was a terrific pop song, catchy and smart, but not everyone thought it was perfect. When Paul's father heard it, he said, "Son, couldn't you sing 'Yes, yes, yes' just for once?" "You don't understand, Dad. It wouldn't work," Paul told him. Page 15. Paul McCartney remembers one morning in 1965 when he literally fell out of bed with a tune running through his head. Still shaking off his sleep, he went straight to a piano and played the whole melody through. Da-da-da, he hummed. Da-da-da-da-da-da-da. He sang words, any words. Scrambled eggs, oh baby, I love your legs. It sounded dumb, but it was a beginning. It was just all there, he said. A complete thing. It came out of nowhere. It was several months before Paul began writing the lyrics to the tune he referred to as the Scrambled Eggs Song. Page 16. Music that changed the world. In the early days, there was a mild competitiveness between Paul and John. What one liked in a song, the other sometimes didn't, yet they admired each other. Sometimes their rivalry had good results. The Beatles' producer said, one would do one thing and the other would say, "Yeah, I can do better than that," and go and do better than that. Later, as the Beatles matured, their musical differences became obstacles. It became harder and harder for them to work together. Paul compared them to four sides of a square without any side, he explained. The square collapses. Together, the square was strong, but the sides of the square finally pulled apart in 1970. Although they separated, the Beatles always felt like brothers. All of them enjoyed success as solo musicians, turning out records and touring for adoring crowds. But some of their musical magic was lost when the Beatles split up. They had been four lads from Liverpool who came together at the right time. To their own surprise, the result was music that changed the world. The end.